high-level representatives of the COP Presidencies of the 3 respective conventions, as well as from the convention secretariats themselves and from the Global Environment Facility. So we're excited to hear them discuss the key issues to be addressed at these COPs and at this COP and at this pavilion and its series of events. And will also serve as a space for thought and reflection on how the conventions can converge for greatest effect. So welcome to our speakers. We have with us here Mr. Ibrahim Tia, Executive Secretary of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. We have, we have Mr. David Cooper, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. We have His Excellency, Mr. Zhao Yingmin, Vice Minister of Ecology and Environment for the People's Republic of China. We have His Excellency, the Right Honorable Lord Goldsmith, Minister of State for Pacific and the Environment of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We have Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, CEO and Chair of our host here, the Global Environment Facility. And we have with us Ms. Cecilia Kanuthia Njenga, Director of the Intergovernmental Support Division of the UNFCCC. So welcome to our distinguished speakers, and thank you all for joining us. So we'll hear remarks from all of our speakers tonight, beginning with Mr. Ibrahim Tia, who will give us our opening remarks.
Thank you, Gabriela, and good afternoon, good evening, friends, colleagues here in the room and from around the world. First, I would like to thank really the CEO of the Global Environmental Facility, as well as the Managing Director of the Green Climate Fund for the opportunity to actually have this facility and to be in a position to have the Rio Pavilion Convention. The idea of the Rio Pavilion Convention is, in my view, a very good one. It originates from the 1992 COP, but it goes beyond just geography, it goes beyond dates. Think of climate change, biodiversity, and land, and the connections that are between these 3 conventions. How can you combat climate change, which is the real problem of our time, if you do not take care of biodiversity? How can you conserve biodiversity or reduce biodiversity loss if you do not take care of land conservation? Of course, you have marine as well, but we are talking here about land. And to us, 3 conventions, climate, biodiversity, and land, we are working together. And the 3 executive secretaries are meeting on a regular basis. Actually, every 2 or 3 months, our Sherpas organize a meeting to coordinate amongst ourselves. And this is extremely important. And I want to report to the world that we are real about this cooperation. Because we are convinced that unless we provide some facilities to our parties, it will be very difficult for small parties, for all parties, in particular the smallest parties in the world, to actually fulfill their mandates, respective mandates, on the 3 conventions. It's a very complex system, and we are likely to confuse the world if we think that you can conserve biodiversity one day, combat climate change tomorrow, and come back to land the day after. It is very important that we all understand that we can and we should manage land, restore, avoid biodiversity loss, reduce emissions, and do mitigation and adaptation at the same time. Do it together. And the good news is that it is possible to do it together. So the 3 conventions, the 3 executive secretaries have agreed now to have a joint communications campaign, and I would like to thank our colleagues from the communications team who have put together a beautiful program. Basically, we need to rethink, as humanity, we need to rethink our relationships with nature. And unless we do it, it will not be possible to combat climate change. It will not be possible to mitigate the impact of droughts. It will not be possible to reduce biodiversity loss. We as humanity, we as human beings, we are the problem. And the solution will come from us. It will not come from nature. Nature does not need us. We need nature. So it is very important that we redefine our relationships with nature. We produce more sustainably and we consume more sustainably. So rebalancing our relations with nature is essentially the message. And the very many examples that have been put together by our communications team that would help us connect the dots. Because most of the time people do not see the relationship between carbon emission and land degradation, for example. And yet when you degrade land, you emit carbon. And yet when you restore land, you actually store carbon back on the soil where it belongs. And when you reduce biodiversity loss, you conserve ecosystems. When you conserve ecosystems, you reduce climate change and you help combat land degradation in the world. So I would like to thank you all for this opportunity. Obviously, I will be happy to come back when necessary. I don't want to monopolize the floor here. Just to say that we three executive secretaries, and I think David and Cecilia will also speak on behalf of the other two conventions, we are very serious about this, and we are at your service as parties of the respective conventions to see how we can help you build these relations at the regional level and at the national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks. It's always humbling to be reminded about the fact that nature does not need us. I think that's an important point that must remain at the core of all of these conversations. And we look forward to seeing the outputs of this new joint communications campaign. I'd like to turn now to His Excellency, Mr. Zhao Yingming, for his opening remarks as well. And do you need a microphone?
好，这个女士们、先生们，晚上好。非常高兴有机会和大家一起讨论里约3公约这个我们如何协同共进的问题。
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss with you how to promote coordinated progress in the 3 Rio Conventions.
这个生物多样性丧失这个气候变化和土地荒漠化呢，是可持续发展面临的全球性的挑战。那么这3者在成因上是密切相关的，所以需要我们协同应对，系统治理。
Biodiversity loss, climate change, and land desertification are all global challenges to sustainable development. They are closely linked in their causes and thus require coordinated action and a holistic approach in their tackling.
采用基于自然的解决方案和基于生态系统的方法加强生态系统的保护和修复，可持续土地管理。维护和增强生态系统功能，这将有助于扭转生物多样性丧失的趋势，遏制土地退化，同时又可以减缓和适应气候变化。
By employing nature-based solutions and an ecosystem-based approach, strengthening preservation and restoration of ecosystems, applying sustainable land management, and enhancing ecosystem functions, it will help to reverse the trend of biodiversity loss, curb land degradation, and at the same time mitigate and adapt to climate change.
事实上，3个领域的工作，如果我们协同共进的话，可以起到降低我们的总的应对成本，同时又可以使得我们应对的效果更快的见效，同时使得我们应对的效果更可持续。
In fact, if we take coordinated actions in promoting progress in these 3 conventions, it will lower our general cost and at the same time magnify their aggregate effect and make it faster and more sustainable.
因此呢，对里约3公约，我们应该既要聚焦各自的授权，也要协同增效，共同守护好我们的地球家园。
Therefore, in implementing the 3 Rio Conventions, we must seek synergy and also while focusing on their respective mandates so as to preserve the one and only planet Earth that we call home.
2周前，在中国的昆明，我们刚刚的成功举办了生物多样性公约第15次缔约方大会的第1阶段会议，应该说取得了非常好的效果。我们举行了领导人峰会、部长级的高级别会议，通过了昆明宣言，完成了大会的所有的议程。
Just 2 weeks ago, we successfully concluded the Part 1 meeting of CBD COP15 in Kunming, China. It was quite successful with fruitful results. We successfully held the Leaders Summit, the Ministerial High-Level Segment, adopted the Kunming Declaration, and finished all the agenda items of the plenary.
特别是大会，有9个国家的元首和联合国秘书长，对这个生物多样性这个全球进一步的提高力度、增加紧迫感，发出了重要的呼吁。那么，大会通过的昆明宣言，应该说为整个生物多样性全球进程注入了强大的政治推动力。那么，昆明宣言的达成，为COP15第2阶段的我们推动达成一个兼具雄心和可力度，这个又平衡可实现的一个2020年后全球生物多样性框架，奠定了一个非常好的政治基础。
In particular, we had 9 heads of state or government and also the Secretary General of the United Nations to speak at the Leaders Summit. Therefore, they call for more urgency in protecting biodiversity and injected strong political momentum in the global biodiversity governance process. And also, by adopting the Kunming Declaration, it laid a good political foundation for reaching a comprehensive, balanced post-2020 global biodiversity framework that is both ambitious and achievable in the Part 2 meeting of COP15.
那么目前呢，我们正在紧张地筹备明年上半年在昆明举行的 COP15的第2阶段会议，同时我们也期待着1月份在瑞士以及第2阶段在昆明举行的会议能够达成这个框架。
Now we are actively preparing for the Part 2 meeting in Kunming in the first half of next year, and also a meeting in Switzerland in January. We hope these meetings will help to reach the framework successfully.
应该说，地球可以没有人类，但是人类不能没有地球。我们里约3公约应该协同共进这个共同从3个不同的方面，但是共同协同来保护好我们赖以生存的唯一的地球。谢谢。
The Earth can survive without we human beings, but we human beings cannot survive without the Earth. So the 3 Rio Conventions should really take concerted action and make coordinated progress so as to protect the one and only planet Earth in 3 different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your remarks. And it's great to hear that you've been having successful meetings and conversations, and we look forward to the results of the COP next year. You also raised some important points on nature-based solutions, as well as the costs that can be brought down by better synergies between the conventions, which I'm sure we'll circle back to these topics later. So I'll take that moment now to ask the audience to please think of questions as the conversations go along, because we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions about any of the topics raised, please keep them in your mind. So we'll now move on to His Excellency Lord Goldsmith for his remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here on this panel with representatives from the 3 host countries and the key people behind the conventions. I think it's, I'm not going to repeat what has already been said, other than to say that it feels very much like this is our last chance. The damage we're doing to the planet is beyond any doubt. Damage we're doing to the world's forests, really cutting them at a terrifying rate. The damage we're doing to the world's oceans, damage we're doing in relation to extinctions. It seems pretty clear that we either change course very profoundly, or each and every one of us will pay the most terrible price. And today at COP26, obviously we're here to do all we can to make this convention a success, but the reality is that many of the solutions that we need to deliver and secure here at this COP are solutions that are no less applicable to the other conventions as well. It's a point that's been very well made already. And the beauty of investing in, supporting, protecting, restoring nature is that in doing so, we tackle not only the problem that we initially set out to solve, but that we solve so many other problems as well. We know that there is no credible pathway to net zero. There's no believable mechanism for staying within 1.5 degrees that does not involve massive increase in our support for protecting and restoring the natural world. But we know that in doing so, we're also tackling so many other challenges we face: poverty, pollution, even pandemics, something that we've learned over the last couple of years. And that's why, as presidents of COP26, if there's one thing we're doing differently to what has been done previously, it's to put nature at the heart of our response to climate change, both in terms of what we're trying to do domestically here in the UK, but also in terms of the international response. And what I am, although I'm cautious about being optimistic, because the gap between where we are and where we need to be is gigantic, I do believe that cumulatively, collectively combined, the commitments that we're securing at this COP will considerably narrow that gap. It has to. But I feel optimistic that it will. So tomorrow, for example, we have a big focus on land use, on nature, on forests. We will have a really serious commitment from countries. I'm not allowed to preempt all the announcements. I wish I could, but I won't. Big commitments from countries on stopping deforestation, unprecedented financial commitments from donor countries for forests, unprecedented financial commitments for those people who are the proven guardians of forests, principally indigenous people and local communities. So an unprecedented package of support for them. A commitment from the multilateral development banks that they will be reconciling their portfolios, not just with Paris, but with nature as well. A commitment around commodities and breaking the link between commodity production and deforestation. Commodity production is responsible for about 80% of deforestation. So we will have a package of really meaningful commitments such that countries that perhaps have been more relaxed about not addressing that link between commodity production and deforestation will have no choice, I would say, but to listen to the signal that the market will be sending. And likewise, really powerful commitments from some of the biggest financial institutions representing trillions and trillions of dollars in investments. So I've probably already gone too far, but I don't think I put numbers to it, so I'm okay. I'm on the right side of the line of what can be said. But tomorrow, there's no doubt in my mind that collectively that package represents, on the surface at least, represents a turning point for nature and a turning point in terms of our relationship with forests. But the absolute key, as everyone here will know, is that it's not just about the commitments that are made. So our job as hosts of COP, as presidents of COP, over the next couple of weeks, is to view what is happening here as a start and not as an end. We secure the commitments. Those commitments add up to something very, very special, but our job is to make sure that those commitments are then honored. And only then is when the job will be done. The next big challenge we have is the challenge faced not just by China when it hosts the CBD in Kunming, but the world in supporting China to deliver the highest possible ambition. But there again, it's not just about setting targets. We all know targets have been set and missed many times over. It's about creating mechanisms to support those targets, mechanisms that allow civil society to hold governments to account, civil society to hold business accounts, governments to hold other governments to account. Because without those mechanisms, the commitments could easily amount to nothing, no matter how ambitious they are on the surface. And the last thing I wanted to say, it is just a huge honor to be next to this man on my left, who I think was one of the most effective environment ministers ever. Did extraordinary things in Costa Rica. And I'm just so happy that he's now presiding over the GEF. And the GEF is, I believe, the only institution that overlaps, the only financial institution that supports all three of the conventions. It could not be in better or safer hands. And my only message is not to him, but to donor countries. Let's step up, let's make sure it has the resources it needs, and let's let Carlos do the job that we know not only he can do, but he absolutely must do. I've probably spoken for too long, so I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your remarks and for giving such an exciting preview of what's to come tomorrow. I think we're all eagerly awaiting to hear that announcement. So thank you for that. And thank you for also commenting on the role of strengthening the role of civil society through mechanisms to support these commitments. That's so crucial. And so we'll turn now to Mr. David Cooper for his remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and Excellencies, distinguished participants. On behalf of Elizabeth Maremma, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, I'd like to join my fellow panelists in welcoming you to this opening event of the Rio Conventions Pavilion. I'd like to express my appreciation to Minister Zhao and Goldsmith for their inspiring words just now, but even more together with Minister Yadav for the work you do, for your leadership as the presidencies of these conventions. I'd also like to echo Ibrahim in thanking Carlos Manuel and Yannick for hosting us here in this GEF-GCF Pavilion, and of course agree very much with what Zach Goldsmith has just said about the leadership of the GEF. And I'd really like to express my appreciation to my colleagues from the other secretariats for our strong collaboration, which Ibrahim has already outlined at the beginning. So we're here in Glasgow negotiating how we're going to achieve the Paris goals. Last month in Kunming and again in Kunming in early next year, we'll be negotiating and finalizing a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, one that must be, yes, ambitious, but it must be effective in that it must be implemented. And later next year, we'll be advancing on land neutrality under the Desertification Convention. As others have said, we can only be successful in each of these if we're looking at them as part of three facets of one problem. And we will only achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we're successful in these three conventions. So we have to be on this journey together. Nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches, as Zach Goldsmith has outlined, whether this is through ecosystem restoration, whether it's through protecting the ecosystems we have, whether it's through better managing our agricultural lands, our pasture lands, can make a major contribution to addressing land degradation and to climate mitigation and adaptation. And we know, in fact, it can be about a third of the total mitigation effort needed. But currently, we're under-investing in these. whereas it can be about a third of the solution. We're only investing about 3%, 4% of the funds so far. We've heard some encouraging commitments from countries, from the UK, from others across the EU, to increase that, also from the GCF. As we invest in ecosystem-based approaches, in nature-based solutions, we'll certainly need to be careful about a number of things. The most important, of course, is these cannot be done instead of strong emission reductions. And they must be done in addition, and they cannot be simply to offset continued emissions. Secondly, they really have to be led by the indigenous peoples and local communities, people on the ground, if they're going to be effective and just. And thirdly, we really need to pay attention to biodiversity and to the ecology. It's not just about planting trees, although, of course, reforestation has a major contribution to take. We need to protect our wetlands. We need to restore our grasslands as well. So in these sessions of the Rio Conventions Pavilion, we'll have an opportunity to explore the opportunities for how ecosystem-based approaches can contribute to the three conventions. We'll have sessions in the coming days on a number of issues on ecosystem restoration itself. We had a session earlier today on finance. We'll be looking at the interface of the three conventions with health and the One Health approach. We'll be looking at the interface of the three conventions with food and agriculture, also in light of the recent UN Food System Summit, and of course the critical role of youth engagement as we go forward. As we continue the journey towards the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the second part of the UN Biodiversity Conference in April-May next year in Kunming, guided by the Kunming Declaration that Minister Zhao referred to, that was adopted a few weeks ago, we'll certainly, from the Secretariat side, be looking to continue to strengthen this cooperation across the three conventions. The importance of cooperation and synergies among these cannot be exaggerated. And I think we can argue that we will only have an effective and a just transformation that we need to address each of these if we look at them together, especially considering the common drivers of climate change, of biodiversity loss and land degradation. So as we continue to work together to build a shared future for all life on Earth, let us continue to work together. I hope you enjoy and engage in the discussions in this pavilion over the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for really stressing how much these conventions must work together, and also stressing that emissions reductions must come in addition to, and these cannot stand in place of that. That's a really important point. We'll now move to our host, Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all the ministers and colleagues from the convention. It is not coincidence that the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility are here hosting this pavilion. We have been collaborating for many years, and a year ago we agreed that we will stop collaborating. Now on, we will be complementing based on the long-term vision, and we mean business. We are serious on this. When I was a minister in Costa Rica and I saw all the different financial facilities out there, I was always extremely confused. How do I access GEF funds, Green Climate Fund, how do I use my bilateral funds in a way that really helps me with those structural adjustments and changes I needed? Because in my country, my biggest challenge is dealing with the consumption and production pattern. For me, there's an implicit approach in integrating all the conventions. Nevertheless, the financial mechanisms were not there near what my needs were. So now, on the head of the GEF, I'm extremely happy that I felt fertile ground for the complementarity. This is where the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, will think on regions and countries for the next 10, 15 years. And I'm so delighted and so happy to have you all here talking about integration. How do we do more integrated approaches? And I would like to tell a couple of personal stories, because this does reflects the needs and most probably the ways forward. When I was appointed as Minister of Environment in 1998 in Costa Rica, and I was approached by the GEF with regards to the funding that I will be able to access to. They told me, you got funds for the Biodiversity Convention, you got funds for the Climate Convention, and you got funds for the Land Degradation Conventions. And my needs were not sectoralized. My needs were, I got high rate of deforestation, I need to revert the high rates of deforestation. I cannot address that challenge just working on each single convention. So I designed a project for creating a payment for environmental services where we will pay people for keeping those forests because of the services that they provide us with. And even though the Biodiversity Convention was very happy with that idea, we had a vision for the integrated management of natural resources at the landscape level. You know, as I presented that idea, the GEF was very supportive, but I received a call from the CBD, UNFCCC, UNCCD saying, you know, that Minister, that's not a great idea because we need to report based on each of the conventions. We got the Rio markers, we got this and the other. It was extremely difficult. And it was kind of a, let Costa Rica try and see what happens over there. Well, if you fast forward 20, 25 years, now we've been able to double the size of the forest cover at the same time that the economy tripled. And yes, we were blessed by this recognition by the Royal Foundation and the Earth Shot. And it began because we saw the need for integration. In 2018, I was appointed again as a minister, and I knew the whole story. This time, I was really being very focused and strategic on how to use the GEF resources, because the GEF is not offering me $150 million. They were offering me $10 million. So I said to myself, how do I use and optimize those $10 million that the GEF is helping me? I said to myself, what is the biggest need Costa Rica does us? And I got to the very quick conclusion that my need is how to do the transition towards a green economy. So I went back to the GEF and said, my project should be the way by which we can go from this irrational neoclassic economic model into a circular economy. And the GEF said, oh, well, we got a problem, Minister, because we need to report on biodiversity, climate change, land degradation. Again, I felt a little bit in a straitjacket, limited by the system. But that was 2018. Then the world champion of nature-based solution came into the scene, Mr. Goldsmith, with this great initiative to bring together nature in the core of the 3 Rio Conventions, and the whole world began changing. And here we are talking about full integration. Into the future, the GEF looks into full integration, and this full integration means that the countries will have full flexibility to use their focal area resources the way they want it. Because we fully understand, because the science and the data is there, we fully understand that if you decide a land degradation, land restoration project, it will have plenty of biodiversity, climate benefits, and the other way around. And that's why we don't only think on giving full flexibility to the countries to use their focal area resources, but also we take a bold decision to go and present to our donors and to recipient countries a new approach in terms of integrated programs, going from 3 integrated programs that works on land use change, food systems, sustainable cities, into 11 different integrated approaches that will give us the possibility to think that we will be helping with limited resources in a more efficient way to maximize those and optimize those resources so they can deliver on the multiple conventions through multiple approaches. And the theory is there, but also the facts are there. So I'm really, really delighted to be here hosting this event with the Green Climate Fund, having the excellencies here with us today to have the conventions. As we recognize, as Minister Goldsmith says, this is the last time, the last opportunity. As a former CBD and climate negotiator, this is the moment for us to close a chapter. 25 years of negotiation. The word negotiation is on our brain. Now we need to change it to implementation, into action. Glasgow will be the landmark moment where we change from negotiation into action, and that action should be integrated, maximizing resources, not just ODA, but also domestic resources, which is important at the end of the day. We need to help countries mobilize public resources. We need countries to mobilize private sector engagement by creating the proper policies and incentives, and that cannot be done if we continue working on silos. And my final message here, as we integrate ourselves more in terms of the vision, in terms of our aspiration, in terms of how we work with the conventions, we need to do the same homework at the country level. We still organize our institutions, our agencies, public agencies on sectors, a Minister of Environment, a Minister of Mining, a Minister of Agriculture, that doesn't respond to the need for more integration at the seascape and landscape level. We need to go from where we are, from these institutional frameworks, towards institutional frameworks in the public sector that addresses the needs and opportunity of the landscape and seascape level. So thank you so much for being today with us. We look forward in GEF 8 to give a big leap forward in how we work with countries in more integrated approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those powerful words and commenting on how silos must be overcome at all levels and nations and internationally in order to really integrate and achieve some of these bold changes that need to lead us to action. And it was also really nice to see some of the relationships that exist on this very stage and how those have overcome barriers together in the past and will continue to do so in the future. So now we'll move to our last remarks from Ms. Cecilia Kanuthia Njenga. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to be here representing our Executive Secretary, Madame Patricia Espinosa, who could not be here with us this evening, but I really hope I will make some good justice as I demonstrate the collaboration between the UNCCD, the UNCBD, and the UNFCCC. It's indeed a great pleasure to be in this distinguished panel. Just listening to all of you, I really feel that we are really on the right path. And, you know, as just has been said, moving from collaboration to complementarity. And this really took me back a few years ago, just after the Rio conferences. And at that time, I was a young activist working very closely to the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the late Professor Wangari Maathai, and basically carrying her bag along. And immediately after the Rio conference, we went into the interim negotiations of the 3 conventions. And I recall wondering, coming from the informal settlements of Nairobi, where I grew up, and where I had made a choice to become a town planner in order for me to work towards ensuring that the people of informal settlements could not continue to live without access to basic services. And moving on and seeing how the fragmented nature in which developmental issues were still being dealt with. I participated in real terms in the interim negotiations as an observer, as a non-governmental actor, particularly on the Desertification Convention for several years. And then I moved to the CBD and then to climate change. And several years after, about 20 years after, joined UNEP, where I moved to the country level and working on SDGs and looking at the voluntary national reports, and now moving towards the need, what you are saying, to look at things in a complementary and integrated manner, and realizing that development does not happen in a disintegrated way. Today, at the UNFCCC, joining Patricia Espinosa and the team there, really excited to see the collaboration that's happening in the three conventions. I say this because I think we need to reflect on our own personal journeys in terms of how we reflect on some of these elements. The IPCC report, that Working Group 1 report that was released very recently, really indicates that it is human activity that is already causing a further 1.1 degrees centigrade. We also do know that some of these changes may become irreversible for centuries in our millennia. But I think the fact that we are trying to demonstrate here, working together, and of course collaborating with the Global Environment Fund, the Global Climate Fund, but also integrating nature-based solutions in our approaches, and realizing that we cannot address biodiversity loss, neither can we address land degradation, and neither can we fully address climate change challenges, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, without having this nexus or collaborative or complementary approach, can we achieve much. As we, together with the presidency, organize this COP, we realized that. And we have selected thematic days, as Lord Goldsmith just mentioned earlier. We have days that are dedicated to issues around land, issues around energy, and it's not just energy in terms of addressing the mitigation aspects, but also energy in terms of ensuring that the millions of people and billions of people around the world who are not having access to affordable energy do have access to affordable energy. And that's the nexus approach I'm talking about. We'll have days that will be, just dedicated to looking at urban and development issues, because these are really important even when we talk about food security. So we're really looking forward to strengthening our collaboration. As Ibrahim mentioned, yes, our communications team have come together. I have just joined as in a new division on intergovernmental processes. We are looking forward to sharing our experience. We are holding this COP also during a very unprecedented times. We've learned a lot of lessons. How do you organize a COP? I know Kunming is coming. CBD has organized their COP also in a two-part process. How can we strengthen that beyond the intergovernmental processes, but addressing the real fundamental elements that can ensure that jointly together that we come not only introduce approaches that can deal and reflect on nature and conservation, but those that bring real transformation for the people that we serve around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Your comment that development does not happen in a non-integrated way, I think really hits home to the core of this conversation and a lot of the core messages that need to come out of this COP as a whole. So thank you. And thank you to all of the speakers for your remarks. We heard such great things from each one of you, and it was wonderful to hear those and to start the COP off this way. So now we'll move to questions from the audience. So please, if you have one, let us know. But I'd like to start with one to His Excellency, the Vice Minister, Zhao Yingming. You mentioned a lot about what's been happening around the COP coming up in Kunming. And I was wondering if you could also speak on the opportunities for the synergies of the three COPs. So the COP that we're at now, the COP coming up in Kunming, and the COP in Côte d'Ivoire.
我想3个公约的协同啊，非常重要。在这个协同的过程中啊，刚才其实有嘉宾已经提到了，都是和我们的经济社会的绿色转型是紧密相关的。如果我们的这个经济社会的绿色转型不实现，实际上这个3个公约的目标都很难实现。
I think coordination and synergy among the 3 Rio Conventions are extremely important. And during this process, it is closely related to a green transition of our economy and society, which is already mentioned by another guest. So if we cannot realize a green transitioning, then we cannot have coordinated progress in the 3 conventions.
所以我想，这个我们3个公约的协同，同时还有一个非常重要的，就是必须得和2030联合国可持续发展议程要协同。
And another thing that is very important in this coordination is to coordinate with UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
那么我想讲一个故事啊，想说一下，就是3个公约或者3个方面的工作是完全可以协同起来的。
I'd like to share with you a story to demonstrate that it is fully possible to have coordination among the 3 conventions.
就在这个COP15这个第1阶段会召开前啊，这个所在地啊，这个中国的云南有15头大象从他们的自然保护区出来了，游荡了17个月，1800公里，引起了媒体的轰动。
Just not long before the convening of COP15 Part 1 meeting, 15 elephants in Yunnan, where the COP15 was held, left their natural reserve and went on a 17-month journey which covered 1,800 kilometers, which caught the wide attention from the media.
这个15头大象走到半道，有一头大象自己回去了，然后呢，剩下14头大象中途还生了一个小 baby， 所以还是15头大象。为什么会出来？有专家有很多的解释，但是我请教了有关这个野生大象的专家，他给我讲了几个数字，我还是很信服的。他讲的理由。
During their journey, one elephant actually returned, and among the rest, the 14 elephants, one gave birth to a baby elephant. So the group was still 15 elephants. But why? Why did they went on that journey? Different experts have different explanations. That I personally sought the advice from an expert of wild elephants, and he gave me some numbers, and I quite believed him.
第一呢，是在中国云南西双版纳的这个亚洲野生象的自然保护区里边，亚洲象的数量种群的数量翻了3倍。
First number is that in Xishuangbanna of Yunnan province in China, in the nature reserve of Asian elephants, the number grew by 3 times.
第二呢，专家讲这个野生象有一个习性，就是如果森林之间的间距超过5公里，它就不会穿越了。那么恰恰是这几年中国的这个生态保护、生态建设、植树造林，使得云南的森林逐步的连成片了，让它走1800公里实现了可能。
Second number is that there is an interesting fact with wild elephants. When the distance between 2 small forests exceed 5 kilometers, they will not cross between them. So in fact, it was due to the reforestation efforts of the Chinese government in the past few years. which made possible that the elephants went on a journey of 1,800 kilometers.
所以大家可以想象，云南这几年的这个植树造林、生态建设和修复所带来的碳汇，所带来的这个土地管理的效益。
So you can imagine the great effect in terms of carbon sink and land management brought by the ecosystem restoration and reforestation efforts of China in these years.
同时呢，我还特别骄傲地给大家介绍呢，云南是中国绝对贫困人数最多的省。那么它在去年年底全部实现了消灭绝对贫困人口。
And I'm also proud to share with you that in the past, actually, Yunnan province was a province with the largest number of people in absolute poverty. And by the end of last year, we actually lifted all these people from abject poverty.
我想说的是，控制荒漠化、保护生物多样性和应对气候变化，乃至消除绝对贫困，这几件事情是同时在云南发生的。那么这个例子，这个故事，我想分享给大家，就是讲3个公约协同是完全有可能的，而且只要我们转变我们的经济社会的发展方式，实现绿色低碳转型，3个公约前景是光明的。
Reducing desertification, protecting biodiversity, and addressing climate change and eradicating abject poverty all happened at the same time in Yunnan province. So I share this story with you to show that it is fully possible to seek synergy and cooperation among the 3 conventions. And as long as we promote a shift in our social and economic development pattern and embark on green and low carbon development, we will have a bright future in implementing our 3 conventions.
谢谢，我希望我这个小故事能回答了你的这个问题。
Thank you. I hope my story had addressed your question.
Yes, thank you for the story. And it wasn't the first time that we heard about how economic growth and development can go hand in hand with environmental goals. So thank you for sharing that story. I think we have a few questions. This is wonderful. Perhaps we start over here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, Excellencies. I have some questions. The link between trade and environment sometimes is not that way. There are many production systems ongoing in different regions that are respecting sustainability and the 3 pillars of sustainability. And there is no just one system that fits us all. So in this case, trade is essential for food supply worldwide. Don't you think that increasing trade barriers or some barriers in agriculture or any other production like livestock or whatever could make risk for global food supply?
It's a really important question. I think it depends what you mean by barriers. So I think countries, all countries, have a responsibility not just to address sustainability issues in their country, but also to address issues around their global environmental footprint. So, it's perfectly possible for a wealthy country to invest in its environment, to improve things in a way that I think most people want, while exporting all the dirty stuff to other countries. And I think it's imperative that countries avoid that. And the way to avoid that is by making sure that trade to and from those countries is sustainable. So, for example, in the UK, we've introduced, introducing, it's not quite law yet, a new due diligence law, which means that the biggest companies that import commodities will have to prove that those commodities were not grown on illegally deforested land. Now, it's not going to address the whole problem, but it'll address a big part of the problem. And in so doing, it reduces the UK's international environmental footprint. I know that China is introducing, or has already introduced, the first part of a new law which addresses the imports of illegal timber and non-timber forest products. The next bit is still waiting to be done, but when that happens, it'll have a massive impact, huge impact on the world, because it means that so much of the destructive produce which flows, in this case through China, will not. And the effect of that, and our due diligence law, and so many other initiatives that are happening around the world, but we need much more, is that producers, wherever they are, will have to start producing in a way that is consistent or reconcilable with the natural world. And we know that's possible. We've seen in Indonesia, for example, as a consequence of increased regulatory barriers, we've seen the government of Indonesia incentivizing the production of palm oil in such a way that it doesn't increase deforestation. We know that's possible. And we know that's a good thing. And yet we haven't seen a reduction in the amount of palm oil being produced, and we haven't seen a reduction in the amount of livelihoods it supports, and we haven't seen a reduction in terms of the value to the Indonesian economy. There's a lot more to do, and I don't want to sound complacent, because I'm absolutely not. But that principle can be applied across the board. And I think if it is, then we'll move to a situation where our economies, our lives, are reconciled with the natural world on which each and every one of us completely depends, unavoidably. So I think it's imperative. We have no choice but to do that.
Thank you. I think Mr. Rodriguez would also like to comment.
Well, yes, of course. We need to really understand what are we talking about when we're talking about trade barriers. But here, when we talk today, 2021, about trade barriers, we need to talk about the failure of the market at the same time, which is the fact that we pollute the environment with chemicals or with carbon, and that is not reflected in the way that they produce and trade. That's one topic. The other topic is we tend to believe that here the big challenge is how do we mobilize financial resources from the north to the south. That is not the big issue. If we're talking about resources, financial resources, the big issue is to stop investing in destroying nature. Everybody, from the wealthiest nation to the poorest nation. There is not one single nation. Even those who are carbon neutral, there is not one single nation that has a positive financial balance within investing in traditional economic activities and investing in nature. We all invest, you know, there was a UNDP report a few years ago that says that we invest 142 times more financial resources in activity that generates deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. So at the end, we need to talk about trade, but we need to put it in that context. The way we can narrow the global financial gap, it can be a climate, chemical, biodiversity, is understanding those wrong policies, those wrong investments. And we got, you know, national development banks investing in those activities. You don't need to go to a shareholder meeting where you got 3,000 shareholders. National Development Bank is just one shareholder. It's called the government. And then we got multilateral banks saying, we don't invest in coal anymore. That's not enough. They need to say, we don't invest in coal anymore, and we are investing heavily in the transition, which is not happening at this point. And then the last point here, we need to understand that we need to do the shift in terms of the tax burden from taxpayers to polluters. if we are able to fully internalize those negative externalities out of our consumption and production system, which is not easy, it's politically extremely complicated. Probably the minister or the president that promotes that will never be reelected, but his legacy will be very strong, very complicated, but we need to level the economic playing field by internalizing those negative externalities and internalizing the positive externalities. Those who do great in terms of managing natural resources, those who operate within the circular economy should be rewarded by the market. So it's not us, Costa Rican, putting pressure on the UK to increase funding to save our forests. It's understanding ourselves that is on our own self-interest to mobilize domestic resources more efficiently without ODA. I see here negotiators conditioning climate action to more funding. I never see a gentleman from that same country conditioning investment in education or healthcare for more ODA. They do that themselves because they know it is in their own self-interest to invest heavily in education and healthcare, but they don't do it when we're talking about climate and nature conservation. So this is that kind of the change of mindset that we need, and that will never happen if we keep on thinking that this is the place for endless negotiation. This is the place for implementation. As we move to our full implementation, our brain wiring began to change. And these are the fantastic things that we will be learning. We have a lot of resources to mobilize at the domestic level in a more efficient way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ed Gemmell, Managing Director of Scientists Warning Europe. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things, and the comment that the damage that's done to the planet now may not be able to be repaired over the following centuries has been said in the IPCC reports to be definite. It cannot be repaired, a lot of it, over the following centuries, and it can be millennia until it's repaired. Mr. Rodriguez wonderfully just talked about policies. I totally agree we need to get much better policies in place in a lot of areas. And talking about trees, which was also mentioned, tree planting, which is fantastic for nature, but can we get policies that protect the trees that are in the ground? In the UK, for instance, we're driving to build more and more houses here. There is nothing in there about preserving the mature trees that are in the ground. There is about canopy cover and a number of other things, but we need to keep those trees that are protecting us from the climate consequences like the Canadian heat wave in the ground now, because any tree we plant is going to take 25 to 35 years to come to our rescue in relation to climate change. I'd like to also put, and then as a question really, is that the issues we're facing are so dire. The technical report of the IPCC that came out, unamended by governments, is so dire that we need to get leadership, and we are not seeing it currently. We need to see the world leaders step up. We know in our hearts that 2050 is not the right target. It is a negotiated target that we're aiming towards, and we are shoehorning the science into getting us there. We need to take realistic targets where Britain, China, and other major countries step up, lead, break from the front of the pack, and show us how we can do it, and then put in place the policies that we really need to defend us, the planet, and nature. Could we please comment on the level of leadership that we're seeing currently?
Would anyone like to comment on that? Mr. Goldsmith, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Look, clearly we need leadership, and it remains to be seen how much leadership we'll see over the next few days. I hope we'll see a lot of leadership. I hope that tomorrow will represent a genuine turning point. I won't repeat what I said earlier, but as I see them coming in, and today has been a very productive day in terms of securing commitments from countries that were reluctant to make commitments. I think the collective commitments tomorrow will represent a turning point. I think they'll be really very significant. My concern is not so much about the level of commitments, it's about our ability to hold businesses, countries, etc., to the promises that they make. And we can't do that alone. That requires everyone. Greenpeace talk about radical transparency, and I think that's what we should be pursuing, both in the context of COP26, also in the context of COP15. Your point about protecting what we already have, absolutely critical. You know, the value of an ancient tree is well, I mean, it's impossible to put a number to it. And it takes many, many, many years for ecological systems to be repaired. But the process of reparation is itself valuable. When you plant or allow an area to naturally regenerate, every day provides benefits. It's a good thing to do. It doesn't mean you're going to get to where you need to get to for 7 years or 10 years or 15 years. It might take, as you say, 500 years for the full beauty of the original ecosystem to be recreated. But every single day in those 500 years is one that yields results and benefits for nature, for people, for climate, and so on. So I think reparation or restoration is a massive part of it. In terms of protection, well, tomorrow, the main emphasis is on protecting. It's on stopping the continued destruction of ecosystems, precisely for the reasons that you've just said. And in the UK too, I mean, we're introducing a bill which comes out, which hopefully becomes law in the next couple of weeks. And that bill commits us to not just protecting ancient trees or even ancient woodlands, but there's a new category that's been introduced, long-established woodlands, which covers woodlands that have been around for 70 or 80 or 90 or 100 years. So again, I don't think it's about the level of protection. I think it is there, or at least it will be there, improved in the next couple of weeks. The question, as with all these things, is one of implementation, making sure that the organizations have enough funding, making sure that the incentives are sufficient to turn the tide on biodiversity loss and nature destruction. And if I could make one final point, when you talk to when you ask ecologists or scientists, what is it going to take to put nature on a road to recovery? How much is it going to cost? And you often get the figure $700 billion. That's the figure. I don't know how people get to that figure, but that's the figure that's often quoted. But that, by coincidence, is also almost exactly the same amount of money that is spent every single year by the big food-producing countries, just the top 50 food-producing countries, subsidizing usually highly destructive land use, causing the problem that we're all here to discuss. If you could get those countries to shift the way they incentivize land use away from destruction towards renewal, that's your $700 billion right there. That is the solution. It's not the only solution, but it is a gigantic part of that solution. And that is something that a number of countries are getting their heads around, including the UK. We have committed to scrapping our land use system. We have basically done so. We've begun the process of transitioning to a new system where every single penny of public money will only be paid out on the condition that it yields a public good. And that could be flood management, biodiversity, environmental management, public access. And that principle applied across the board would be really, truly transformative. So I think people get scared by the amounts of money that we're going to have to find. But a lot of it's just about not spending money badly and instead spending that money well. Public money, but also, as Carlos was saying, private sector finance as well. There's no point the World Bank spending money on biodiversity here and climate there if the rest of the portfolio is destroying nature. Well, it's unfair to pick on the World Bank, but the big multilateral development banks, they need to reconcile their entire portfolios, their entire existence with the natural world. Because until we do that, until every single business does that, until every single government does that, we're going to continuously be playing catch up. That's the profound challenge that we face.
我简单回应几句啊，我非常同意你说的，就是我们应对我们现在面临的紧急的、严峻的形势，的确不能仅仅是口号，必须要行动。
I'd like to make a few comments. I agree with you that to respond to our now very urgent circumstances, we must take real actions, not just remain, not just to produce more empty slogans.
实际上，中国有句话：不可实现的目标不叫承诺。
In China, we have a saying that a goal that cannot be reached is not a promise.
中国过去一直在努力，我给你报几个数啊。新能源汽车，中国截止到9月底，上个月底啊，我们保有量是全国是680万辆，其中81%是电动汽车，这个数字超过了全球保有量的1半以上。
In the past years, China has been making great efforts in this regard. I'd like to share with you some numbers. By the end of September, China's ownership of new energy vehicles reached 6.8 million, and 81% of them are electric ones. This is more than half of the world's total.
上个月的月底之前啊，中国的电动汽车的充电桩已经达到了220万台，车桩比是3比1，也就是3台电动车就有1个充电桩。
And before the end of September, the charging pole for electric vehicles in China was 2.2 million. 2.2 million. That means every 3 electric cars can share 1 charging pole.
第3个呢，目前中国的可再生能源的装机容量占到了全球的33%。那么每年新增的可再生能源的装机量占到了全球新增量的52%。
And the total installed capacity of renewable energies in China accounted for 33% of the world's total. And the annual increment of installed capacity of renewable energies of China accounts for 52% of the world's total.
中国目前的可再生能源的装机总容量和发电量都是世界第一。
And currently, the total installed capacity and also the generation capacity of China's renewable energies all ranking the #1 in the world.
而且已经连续8年，全球可再生能源的投资第1大国一直是中国。
And for 8 years in a row, the largest investor in renewable energies has been China.
而且现在全球每年新增的森林面积当中，有20%来自中国。
And now, globally, of the increased forest coverage of the world, 20% comes from China.
这只是我们已经做到的。那么这次呢，中国提交的新的 NDC 和这个长期战略，非常详细的介绍了到2025年中国要做什么，做到什么程度，哪些领域做。
And these are what we have already achieved. And in the recent updated NDCs and long-term strategies we have submitted, it clearly laid down what we will do and what areas we will take action by 2025.
实际上是到2025年和到2030年，也就是未来10年，我们怎么做，做什么啊？非常详细，10大行动计划，详细到每一个领域，比如说钢铁行业，水泥行业等等，都要有具体的行动计划、实施方案。
It clearly specifies what we will do by 2025 and 2030. We have 10 action plans and have detailed plans for what we will do in specific areas and industries such as steel and cement.
所以我想说，就是我们应对这个严峻的挑战，要多做，而不是说。谢谢。
So, what I want to say is that faced with the arduous challenges, what we need is more actions, not more commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. I think we have time for one more question. This lady here.
Hello, thank you. I think we've heard very exciting preview of what to expect here at COP26. And also we've heard very interesting points on what we will see in the CBD COP in Kunming. But I was wondering what can we expect also for the UNCCD COP in Côte d'Ivoire next year, and how these synergies will be touched upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When ministers speak, you listen, and what they said is absolutely essential. Coming to the UNCCD COP in Côte d'Ivoire, two issues are likely to dominate the debate. One is the issue of drought. We see more and more severe droughts, and we see the consequences of these droughts being really dramatic. It is no longer only limited to dry countries. Droughts are now affecting Siberia. Droughts are now affecting the northern part of the United States. It is worldwide. And no country is immune to drought, and no society will be spared by the consequences of this, be it direct consequences or indirect consequences. So droughts are coming big time. They are negotiated under the UNCCD, but they are cross-cutting. Droughts affect biodiversity. Droughts are amplified by climate, hence the links that we talked about earlier. The second issue, which is likely to be discussed, is large-scale restoration programs. We now understand that to combat climate change, to combat biodiversity, to combat poverty, to reduce gender gaps, to reduce inequalities, to promote jobs in rural areas, you need to invest in land restoration. And large-scale restoration programs are being promoted all over the world, be it in the Middle East, in China, in Pakistan, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe. It is now understood that investing on land restoration brings multiple benefits to humanity. And it is cheap, it is technologically accessible, and it can be done by anybody. You, me, you don't have to have a PhD to do land restoration. So it is probably one of the topics that is going to be brought as one of the solutions to achieve the SDGs, because land restoration is a glue to many of the goals and that we are aiming at by 2030. So these two issues plus multiple other issues. Now, how that intersects with climate and biodiversity, which is basically what we are discussing here, is very obvious to us. Because when you restore land, you store carbon in the soil. Soil carbon is absolutely essential. And I just wanted to make a comment here because in a previous question, people talked about deforestation. And yes, deforestation is a big issue in the world. I'm a forester by training. I know what I'm talking about. But there's another impact, which is land conversion in steppes and rangeland. You don't see trees falling, but there's a major disaster that is looming to humanity, because land conversion in grasslands and rangelands is reaching up to 90% in some regions of the world. And no one is caring about it because no tree is falling. It is not, there's no image in your conscience that resembles the big tree that we saw falling this morning in the video. And yet, when you convert that land, which was storing carbon, which it was providing food for animals, which was basically promoting livestock, and you transform it into a single, product, agricultural product, which is essentially destined to trade, to selling to other countries, then you are transforming your ecosystems and destroying your capital, basically to provide services to others. So these are the things, they are very complex issues, but they are interconnected. And again, it is impossible to anybody to think today, I hope that was that is not really understood by everybody, but it was probably understood by the forefathers or mothers who brought the 3 conventions together. It is impossible to combat climate change without conserving biodiversity. It is just no imagination for that. At the same time, it will be impossible unless you do it only in marine areas. But if you are dealing with terrestrial ecosystems, you cannot conserve biodiversity without conserving by degrading land. So the interconnection is very obvious to us. So I hope parties will understand this, and I hope policies that are coming by governments will actually promote this. I hope the subsidies that we talked about will also take these issues into consideration. So to summarize, we have 2 issues to address: a growing population and a growing middle class and a growing demand on finite resources. The second issue that we really need to address is our consumption patterns. They are not tenable. The world is heading to a catastrophe if we continue to consume in the way we do. Yes, we can drive electric cars and we feel comfortable that we are not polluting, but electric cars are polluting. Electric cars are actually contributing to climate change in a way or another, because the production is very expensive to nature. So we have to be really thinking, very loudly, very clearly about the sustainability of the lifestyle of ours as humanity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tia. I don't think I could say too many things much better than you just did. It's been so enriching from all of you, from all of your remarks. Thank you so much for joining us, just to see, hear, and feel how these conventions are really joining forces and working together, and how that's the pathway we must take. We also heard a lot about economic development and how we need to change the context of how we think about trade, also in light of consumption patterns and growing populations. And then lastly, we heard some really optimistic remarks about how this is the COP where we'll see negotiations transition into real implementation and action, which is what we need to see. So this was a great way to start the COP. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to hear from all of you. And everyone, please come back to this pavilion for more great events.